Hello everybody, it's Grandmama with another story from our Hometown Scrapbook by Ben Weatherwax. The Canal. Hello there, we're going to tell a continued story tonight. A yarn that's been gathering chapters here in the Hometown Scrapbook since way back in 1876. And the last chapter hasn't been written yet. It's one of those great, engrossing dreams of Grays Harbor that has been cherished and has from time to time trotted out and been dusted off. It's made a lot of conversation, and almost every generation since the first settlement here in the southwest Washington has played with the idea and dreamed the dream. It was responsible for some pretty elaborate government documents and thousands of inches of newspaper copy. Well, that's enough of a blind lead. Let's come right out with it and tell you that we have the scrapbook open tonight to one of Grays Harbor's greatest dreams, the ship canal of Puget Sound, a dream that while it's as yet unfilled, still it may someday become a reality. And when it does, it will do for Grays Harbor, at least for many things, its dream to have a promise for nearly 3/4 of a century. Well, we'll get to that shortly, but first, a few words from Dick and our sponsors. It was back in 1876 that men looking over the frontier northwest first got the idea of a canal to the coast to connect Puget Sound with the Pacific somewhere south of the Strait of Juan de Fuca. The reason why there had been flurries of excitement from time to time over the attitude of the British, and thought that it might be desirable to have an access route to the south that was entirely through the American territory. And so the survey was ordered by President Rutherford B. Hayes, and a party of engineers chased down the water course from the Olympic Peninsula between the Sound and the ocean, looking for a route for the Big Ditch. When they found it, or in fact several, they made their recommendations to President. And as things generally happen, by the time they got around to stacking up the evidence for examination, a fellow by the name of James A. Garfield was then president. The idea for the canal did not originate on Grays Harbor. It was, in fact, almost unknown to the residents of the district in 1876 when the government surveyors were pulling their chains through the virgin timber and shooting the levels of Black Lake and the upper Chehalis rivers. No, it was not a Grays Harbor dream back then. It was the dream of important people thousands of miles away in Washington, D.C., people who had not heard of Grays Harbor. Back in 1905, when Elias J. Payne of the Olympia Chamber of Commerce began to plump for the ship canal to the Pacific Ocean, it was very much a Grays Harbor project. For in the years that spread between 1876 and 1905, a lot of starry-eyed frontier builders had looked at the map of Washington Territory, and later the state of Washington, and decided that a canal about here, tracing the course with a finger over a letter opener, would turn the Puget Sound area into the finest inland waterway in the world. They took their views quite naturally, for it was the age of canals. There was a lot of serious digging going on down in Panama that year. Probably that had more to do with the 1905 reincarnation of the Grays Harbor Puget Sound Canal project than anything else. Anyhow, in October of 1905, Olympia began thumping the tub at the end of a line and demanding for a big ditch between the Sound and the harbor was heard again. Well, it got very little attention at that time. Oh, there was a little action in the state legislature, but someone got busy and figures he produced on cost stopped all further activity to the point. So bury the Grays Harbor dream for another decade. This time we look for about 1915, February to be exact. It popped up in the state legislature, this time in a new suit. It was described as a bill to create a canal between Grays Harbor and Willapa Harbor to drain thousands of acres of rich boglands along the ocean beaches and to provide the two harbors with a freight connection closer than 70 miles of railways that ran their circuit course between the two harbors back as far as Centralia before they got back onto their targets again. The Grays Harbor-Willapa Harbor Canal was to be 12 miles long and 50 feet wide. It could connect South Bay on Grays Harbor with Willapa's North Cove. Again there was talk, and slowly the great dream died with the bill. The subsequent bill that would have connected Grays Harbor with the Sound after the Willapa Harbor Canal had been dug never even came out of committee, and the dream went back into the mothballs for another long stretch. Now at this point, let's observe that we have noted about the place in which we live. It has a persistence about its dreams that it's hard for anyone but a New Englander to understand. It may resign itself to fate, or the majority, or the whim of fortune, but it is ready at the slightest provocation to reopen the old contest, to reweigh the dead issue, to refight a once finished battle. How many wars have been fought for adequate jetties to protect the old harbor? How many times did people of Aberdeen march militantly to the polls to reaffirm their demands for an adequate water supply? How long did Grays Harbor advocates of the county seat in Hoquiam carry their torches to shout for their war cries? No, lost battles rankle for years in the minds of harbor folk, like the ache of an old wound, the mental pangs of a disavowed conviction. Grays Harbor is a spot on this moldy old earth where causes die bravely and seldom permanently. So, do you follow me? So, then came a document over the hand and seal of Governor of the State of Washington dated July 6, 1933. In the good regal fashion of public document, it called for the biggest of all projects. It picked up the old dream and magnified it 20 times. It spoke for a canal that would make possible inland waters navigable from Lewiston, Idaho to Ketchikan, Alaska. A canal that would link together the Columbia River, Willapa, Grays Harbor, Puget Sound, and the Inside Passage to Alaska. And now, those who had quietly shrugged off the defeats over 30 years of advocating the big canal, they now armed with the biggest battle of all. Here was a cause that the harbor might risk its whole future on. Southwest Washington lunged and shouldered the load of the fight. If you can recall the Grays Harbor of 1933, and if you lived here, it's not probable that the picture will ever escape you. You will recall with what magic the gubernatorial message was packed. Grays Harbor was in the depths of the Great Depression. No, just in doesn't describe it. The harbor wallowed, barely floating, seemed stuttered in the bottomless blackness of the hardest times that the Northwest has ever known. The nation found it hard going. The Northwest, with its vulnerable forest industry, found it twice difficult, and the harbor of all the Northwest was the dark spot under a stone with a black cloud over it. Yes, the harbor that once had set the pace for word production for the nation now set the record for unemployment, for lack of business, for pessimism, and for business decline that looked on statistical charts like a downward trajectory of an aviation bomb. And into the blackness of the Depression was hurled the bright promise of a great canal project, brighter than the gayest dreams of the harbors of old. And while the Corps of Engineers, attorneys, and statisticians, to say nothing of the clerks labored to complete the report and provide the answer, Grays Harbor basked in its enthusiasm as an old dream soon was going to be accomplished. Whenever maps of western Washington hung on walls, there were freshly scribbled pencil marks showing a proposed route for a canal, the only feasible route for a canal, or just a route. While the myriad of clerks counted yachts, tugboats, barges, and inland steamers, Grays Harbor thought of transoceanic liners clearing across its bar for faraway points in the Orient. The engineers chained miles and noted elevations, and Grays Harbor talked of yacht clubs for Grays Harbor members who would be whisked away for Alaska via the Inland Passage, or take off for Portland in a family yacht. Boats, that was the word more frequently mentioned than yachts in 1933. Boats would be as common as a requirement in the harbor as the automobile had been, and for a local scribe. And then he advanced his theory that people would travel from the harbor to Portland, Seattle, or Tacoma in their boats, more leisurely and pleasantly than cars. The full life was to come. While photographers took aerial photos and model makers labored over contours and profiles, Grays Harbor industrialists dreamed of Oregon timber floating into the harbor through the canals to restock the county's slacking timber supply. While the commissioners finally finished their job and published their report and made their recommendations, the canal was to leave Olympia at Bud's Inlet and proceed to Black Lake, then down Black River to the Chehalis Valley, down the Chehalis Valley to Montesano, where it would join the Chehalis River, and come down the valley to Grays Harbor. To the south, it would leave Grays Harbor's South Bay and cross the Cranberry Boasters, greater in scope than anything that had ever been projected. For this time, the state proposed to do it right. The lawmakers had enacted a bill, Senate Bill number 267 they called it, and the preamble to the act read like this: an act providing for the survey, definitive location, construction, maintenance, operation, and disposal to the United States of canals connecting Puget Sound with Grays Harbor, Grays Harbor with Willapa Harbor, Willapa Harbor with the Columbia River, creating a canal commission, defining its powers and duties, making the appropriation for other purposes, declaring an emergency, and providing that this act shall take effect immediately. There it was. And suddenly the harbor seized at the luminescent vision of something that would restore the flow of the community's economy, start the business curve back again, and more than ever than that, give the harbor a new place in the sun as a link in one of the world's greatest inland waterways. Well, it's not hard to see that they didn't build any canals. So let's see what happened to the dream that this was. Governor Clarence Martin appointed the commission. In accordance with the wording of the act, 3 commissioners were appointed, 1 from each of the counties in which the canal would pass, and 2 at large. George Gaulet and W.H. Abel were named from Grays Harbor. With the other 3, the commissioners rolled up its sleeves and went back to work. It began to survey to locate the most suitable routes for the canals. It started work in shifting the mountain of economic data that would prove the most feasible for such an enormous project. It projected a report that would contain all of the long discussed but never answered questions. Could a canal be expected to pay for its way? What lock system would be best suited for the waterway? How would it be financed? And countless other questions. Bogs to the Willapa Harbor, and from the south side of the dredged out harbor, it would cut through the narrow isthmus near Oahu and join the Columbia. The most feasible plan called for 12 locks, a bank of 5 just west of Olympia to move the ships up the grade to Black Lake, with lock number 12 near Montesano as the traffic settled back to the level of salt water. There was also a sea level scheme, as well as a deep, medium, and light draft channels. There was data on available water supplies to operate locks, distances to other navigable ports, and the value of butter produced in the area, the value of chickens and bees, and the tonnage of world shipping. I think exhaustive would describe the report that the Commission turned in, and Grays Harbor, along with Thurston and Pacific counties, threw out its community chest and anticipated the start of work on the big canal. But it never started. No, the dream was still made of flimsy stuff. Reasons? Oh, cost, disagreements between some of the links of the project, failure of the backers to select a single plan of reports to concentrate on it, politics and other reasons that had blocked the great dream since the first government engineer had started with President Hayes on the project. And it remains still a dream of those who would see the Northwest develop to its potential greatness, a dream that is now 3/4 of a century old. Dick, a few words from our sponsor, please. Well, the dream of the canal to link together all the waterways of the Northwest isn't too far-fetched. It has been realized along the East Coast, where small boaters owners sail from Boston to Miami through the inland waters. But they had no black hills to cut through. They had no banks of 12 locks to lift and lower ships. The canals along the Atlantic is built with an easy way, tidal level ditches connecting existing waterways. What is most remarkable is that the great dream did not materialize when the commissioners made its report. Everyone admitted that it would be too much for the Northwest, perhaps more than Grand Coulee. The report was submitted, complete and comprehensive at the time when the government of the United States was looking for projects to make work for the unemployed Americans, and when money for the big dream was no penny ante project, when money was no item. But it was abandoned then, as it had been many times before, and the dream continues. The dream of a day when Grays Harbor will connect with the Columbia, with the Puget Sound, and by maze of canals through the brackish waters of commerce, a greater and richer Grays Harbor. And that's the Big Ditch story, as we find it here in our Hometown Scrapbook. Thanks for listening.